Well, last week we started the section in Ezekiel, a quick overview of the book of Ezekiel. The first 24 chapters deal with this warning of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And God gives them all these different warnings. He puts Ezekiel through all these different things to finally that he brings about what he prophesied that he would do, that he would destroy the temple and destroy Jerusalem. Then chapters 25 through 32, he actually then brings judgment after he judges his own house first. He then brings judgment to the nations, and especially to the Islam nations, is chapters 25 through 32. Then it works through a process of where we start becoming very futuristic in what's taken place in chapters 33 through 39. Now, most of you know the chapters probably 37, 38, and 39 the most. 37 being the chapter of the dry bones can live again. Chapters 38 and 39 being the war of Gog and Magog. And then 40 through 48 is the segment that most pastors and teachers try not to deal with because it is a tedious one. And if you do not have good guardrails of prophecy rules, people go, I'm not sure which segment of time they're dealing with. Remember, one of the things in prophecy, there's a passage that could have several time periods. You have to keep that in mind when you're going through that, and that's where we're at tonight. Let me give you a shorter review than I gave you last week, and a couple new things that I added in your notes about the millennial age. Yes, it's going to be a time of change. This is after the Great Tribulation. Christ comes back, his feet land on the Mount of Olives, where they will sacrifice here. Either they could have done it today. They haven't reported that they've done it. They started their conference today. This is the prophecy update right now. They started their conference today, the Noahic Covenant Conference here on the 25th. They advertised, they gave a prelude way back a couple weeks ago that during this conference they would do a Noahic covenant sacrifice in honor of the blessing of God over the world after Noah got off the ark. It's a very interesting read. They put more out on it today since the conference started in Israel earlier today. Remember, they're 10 hours ahead of us. And they have actually got a coalition. They didn't give the list of all the nations. They named several from Central America and several from Africa and several from South America. But they said they have a representation of 70 nations for this conference. And that if you understand how sacrifice law works in the Old Testament, they are not supposed to sacrifice outside of a tabernacle or outside of the temple. So they're sacrificing on an altar on the Mount of Olives. This is one of the loopholes that you can do because they have Gentiles there. The Sanhedrin will instruct, but the 70 nations will be the ones that will actually activate this in this time period. So it's a very interesting part that when Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man. We are in a season that is seeing all these different convergence of prophetic promises that have come to pass in our lifetime and especially in the last couple years. 5 things that I wanted to tell you about the millennium, and I have 4 of them in your note here. The physical change in the world, we looked at it last week, so we won't that, but I added a little note here that if you didn't realize it, the life expectancy, that yes, you could live for 1,000 years during the millennial reign. So the second thing that's not in there is how do they live from that? Scholars believe that there must be some access to either the river of life or the tree of life. Okay? Both are talked about in heaven. What's happening in the Remember, the phrase is, it will be like paradise. What was in paradise? They could eat from the tree of life that would cause them to live. And Revelation talks about a river of life. And so there's just speculation on that. So I thought I'd throw that in there all within number one, like a number one and a number 1A. The curse is lifted. Now this is a little more detailed than last week. The curse is lifted is talking about nature especially. So in Isaiah number 3, Isaiah 11:6, the lion and the lamb, or some translation says the wolf and the lamb, if you have the NIV, will be able to lie down together. In other words, the animals with the curse lifted, they will all be vegans. They will not be eating each other. All right, so that's important to know. And then the earth is filled, again in that same section of Isaiah 11:6-9, the 9th verse is, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord. This is an introduction to the millennial age. We said so much more on it last week. We're not going to recover that this week. We're going to go right on into chapter 43. As last week, I picked the segments that I felt like you needed to know when they go into the long details of what the altar and the things within the sanctuary or within the practices of the priests and everything. I skipped those sections for the long reading that you can read them. I have notes about them in your study guide. So here we go, chapter 43, and we're going to look at the first 7 verses here. This is, I like this. This is kind of like Ezekiel's private tour guide when it says the man. This is the one that gave him this vision in chapters 40 through 48. And if you remember in chapter 40, it says he felt like the vision that he had at the river Kabar at the very beginning of being called a prophet, where God showed him futuristic things about the temple being destroyed and Jerusalem being destroyed, that he felt like it was the same thing, and that's what's taking place. So this man is back in chapter 43. The man brought me to the gate facing east, and I saw the glory of God of Israel coming from the east. His voice was like a roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory. The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the vision I had seen by the Kabar River, and I fell face down. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside me, I heard someone speaking to me from inside the temple. He said, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet." The soles of my feet is very important, and I'll explain that in just a moment. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. The people of Israel will never again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitutions and the funeral offerings for their kings at their death. All right, let's pause right there. I love this. The glory is back. When I was growing up in the church, there was all kinds of songs about the glory of God. Do you remember singing those songs? I had a friend of mine, he now lives in Florida, Ian Trotman. He used to have this song that he sang as a song evangelist about the glory falling down, and Holy Spirit, let it just rain down upon us. And oh, he could just sing that. I could listen to that for hours and hours, and you just felt like you were then in the presence, the Shekinah glory of God. This is kind of the picture that we're here. Number one, God left Solomon's temple during the captivity. That's temple number one. We saw that earlier in the book of Ezekiel, where it says you saw his spirit. This was all before the destruction of the temple. It said the spirit went out through the east gate. And now, very interestingly, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 6, these are the words of Jesus in here. One greater than the temple is here. It talks about the glory of God being in the temple. One greater than the temple is here. When Jesus walked the streets of Galilee, he declared he's greater than the temple. Now, the second temple is already built when he's saying this in Matthew chapter 12, verse 6. So, here's what you need to know. The glory is not in the second temple. It's not there in the Holy of Holies. Those high priests and the others had to fake it for a long time. They went in there and did the stuff. They were still very fearful. Remember, in the first temple, if they went in unclean, they could die, and they would tie a rope on their ankle, and they'd have to pull them out because they wouldn't risk going into the presence of God. But that presence of God left here in the Babylonian captivity out the east gate. It didn't return for the second temple. It will not return for the third temple. That's there in your notes. So the voice that Ezekiel hears from inside the temple is the voice of God. So this is futuristic beyond the Great Tribulation. The third temple, many scholars believe, will be built either right at the beginning of the Great Tribulation or in the first 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, because it has to be there at the middle section for the Antichrist to put his false image in there and say, worship this image. Okay? So we know it's coming back. So this has to be a futuristic temple during the millennial reign that it's talking about, where his spirit is there and the voice of God is coming from that. Number 5, as we go through all this, you're going to see the Ark of the Covenant is not remembered any longer. This is a prophecy, Jeremiah chapter 3:16. If you ever want to have a fun thing, go through the Bible and read all the chapters 3:16 ones in the Bible, and you'll find so many very interesting things. Okay, and Jeremiah 3:16 actually spells out what I'm telling you right here is that they will remember the Ark of the Covenant no more. In that day, in that season, and some of the translations at that time. Okay, so what time is it? You now know it's in the millennial time. All right, the focus now in the temple is the mercy seat. Oh, that was part of the Ark of the Covenant. So let me give you a little stuff for, if you got some space on your page there, a little note there. If you remember, he said that his throne would be there and a place for his feet. If you knew Levitical practices, when the high priest would go in on the Day of Atonement, he'd have to take the blood of the shed lamb, and what we have to do is he would sprinkle it on the mercy seat, and he'd sprinkle it in front of the Ark of the Covenant, where the feet would be. All right? So many scholars believe that's why this references, there'll be my throne and a place for my feet, is all connecting the old Levitical practices here with the millennial. All right. As we go through this, let's look at this next section, and there's a key verse in it. I'm going to tell you up front since I put it in your notes. It's verse 10. It is what I call a pivotal aha moment within explaining what the future will deal with in the worship of God, how the new worship in the millennial age and what's taking place here. Okay, so let's pick it up in verses 8 through 13. When they placed their threshold next to my threshold and their doorpost besides my doorpost, with only a wall between me and them, they defiled my holy name by their detestable practices. So I destroyed them in my anger. Now let them put away from me their prostitution and their funeral offerings of their kings, and I will live among them forever. Son of man, that's the title that God used for Ezekiel there. I know sometimes in the New Testament you hear Son of Man, you're thinking it's Jesus. This is Son of Dust is really what is translated in the Hebrew. Okay, Son of Man, describe the temple to the people of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their sins. Let them consider its perfection. Oh, I love that. And if they are ashamed of all that they have done, make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangement, its exits and entrances, its whole design, and all its regulations and laws. Write these down before them so that they may be faithful to its design and follow all its regulations. This is the law of the temple. All the surrounding area on the top of the mountain will be most holy. Such is the law of the temple. All right, one more verse here. These are the great measurements of the altar in long cubits. That cubit being a cubit and a handbreadth. A cubit, remember, is from the elbow to the tips of your fingers, and then a handbreadth, that was a long cubit. All right. So that's the description of the size there. That the cubit being a cubit and a handbreadth, its gutter is a cubit deep and a cubit wide, with a rim of one span around the edge. And this is the height of the altar. Now, the rest of the chapter goes through kind of what we did in the others, but there's some things in here about Zadok, and we picked that up because it picks it up in 44. So that actually is going to complete chapter 43 for us, but we're going to tell you what you're missing in some of this and give you that. But there was a key verse, as I told you. Listen to it in the King James Version. Thou son of man, show the house to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their, what? Iniquities. That's an important part of this that comes out in this translation of the King James. And let them measure the pattern. All right. Now, two things there within 10 that the NIV doesn't bring out. That first off, what they're dealing with in this segment of 43, actually all the way through 45, but we're only going to deal with 43 and 44 tonight, is the iniquities of the priests, the Levites. The Levites split under Solomon as king. We'll get into that here in this next chapter real quick with the righteous priests of the lineage of Zadok of the Levites and the unrighteous Levites and what that takes place. But because it used the words iniquity, it means the sins of their forefathers, that God wants them to remember what the past was. Many of them never even saw sacrifices unless they saw it during the third temple, which the sacrifices seem to be being reactivated here even as we speak this week. So this is a detailed, and then he gives detailed stuff around the altar, all right? The perfection of the pattern. What do you need to know about that verse in chapter 43? First, the pattern is a reference to prophecy. You knew that already, didn't you? I love that. Even in the NIV where it says, let them consider its perfection. You know, the perfection of God showing the patterns. Now, he says this several times. He said this in chapters 40, 41, and 42. I want to show you the details. Now remember, the details are different than Solomon's temple that he builds. It's different than the rebuilt temple after the Babylonian captivity. It's different than what they believe will be the third temple. So this must be the millennial temple that they're looking at, unless something supernatural happens, because the size of this temple is much bigger than what anybody could anticipate they could build and get away with in this season because of what's happening with the Muslims and Islam on the Temple Mount, because really the walls take in more than the Temple Mount itself. All right, so that's why many think it has to be futuristic beyond the third temple in this. So the pattern speaks about prophecy. Remember, most Protestants think prophecy is a prediction and a fulfillment. We tell you about things that God is predicting, but we show you the pattern, how it lines up, that he's the same yesterday, today, and forevermore, and you can see how he operates. The temple, if you didn't know it or not, the very first temple is built because there is a temple where? Scholars, you know. Where's there a temple? That there's always been a temple. There's one in heaven. Yeah, there's a temple in heaven. So what they built on earth here was something that was represented in heaven. Oh, now all of a sudden, as you think about temple and why are they coming back to temple stuff, it's not because of the Jewish religion. It's not because of Judaism. There's something in heaven that God has as the temple that he gives the plans to Solomon to build. Here's the first temple, and we're starting to see a glimpse that this is more of a heavenly glimpse here on earth. And you go, what does all that mean? Hopefully we can explain it to you. Number two, the pattern is also reference to the mercy seat or the throne of God. Now, if you read Jeremiah 3:16 and it says the ark is there's no need for its remembrance. Why? Because God is not going to be contained within a containment like he was in Solomon's temple in this. And so what's really interesting is, where's the mercy seat come from? The possible answer is Ethiopia. Okay? Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 40. If you remember, the Ethiopian was going to Jerusalem. He'd been reading Isaiah 53. He didn't understand it. Philip catches up to him. Philip says, I heard you reading this. This is about the Messiah. He says, I have a gift for the Messiah. Many scholars believe what the Ethiopian was bringing to Jerusalem was the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat. Isn't that interesting? If you never heard that or read that portion of it, really interesting. So when you look at the book of Acts, and what I'm giving you there in number 3 here, is the Ethiopian was going there, and Philip says to him, he's no longer here. He's went to heaven. And so many believe the Ethiopian took the Ark of the Covenant back to Ethiopia. All right? So took it back, and Jeremiah prophesies there won't be a need for the ark, but the mercy seat, really, what greater throne would Jesus really rule from than the mercy seat itself? That many believe that's the throne that will be the throne of David in the millennium, that Jesus rules from is the mercy seat, because he is the God of mercy. Amen? And so now what's different also in this temple than the first temple. Remember, his presence not in the second, it won't be in the third. But in the first temple, his presence was in the Holy of Holies. Number 4 here, the holiness of God will fill the whole building. It's not just contained to a section called the Holy of Holies. It actually fills the whole mountain as you listen to the descriptions in detail. So the presence of God is all over the mountaintop there. And so very, very interesting, cool things that are taking place. Again, all this is futuristic about an age that is still in our future beyond what's called the Great Tribulation, a 7-year period where Israel and the world is coming under the wrath of God to turn the world, and especially the nation of Israel, to the Messiah. All right. That's the descriptions of what then takes place around the altar, the sizes of it, and how they do the sacrifices and all that is futuristic. Most scholars have no idea why or how that's coming to pass. That we know this, the priest in the future, as we're going to pick it up here in chapter 44, the priest will teach the people about these sacrifices and why they're different. We get a glimpse on this side. I love, that's what prophecy really is. It's a glimpse of what is coming. We get a glimpse why sacrifices in a millennial age. All right, let's pick it up and look at verses 1 through 3 of chapter 44. Then the man, this is his tour guide that's given him this vision, then the man brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, the one facing east, and it was shut. The Lord said to me, the gate is to remain shut. It must not be open. No one may enter through it. It is to remain shut because the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered through it. The prince himself is the only one who may sit inside the gateway to eat in the presence of the Lord. He is to enter by the portico, or the actual word is like a porch there, so it's like a side entrance of the gateway, and go out the same way. All right. So the east gate becomes very, very important here. Let me give you some of the things that we know about it. It was always open in the Old Testament. How interesting. In the Old Testament, the east gate was open. Remember, the Spirit of God was in the temple. When it leaves during the Babylonian captivity, when he's going to destroy the temple in Jerusalem, it says the Spirit of God left and went out the east gate, and you saw it go by the Mount of Olives. Where's Jesus coming back? He's landing on the Mount of Olives, and it says his Spirit's going to enter in through the east gate. And during the millennial reign, that east gate is to remain shut, never to be open. All right, so the prince cannot enter through it. All right, we're in the next section, we're going to see, who is this prince? Who could this prince be? But we're still on the east gate. The east gate is, if you haven't caught it yet, it's where the Shekinah glory, that you could sense the glory of God. It's where the glory left and the glory returned to the temple. The east gate is special to the Lord. Scholars haven't figured out why is this so special, except for those that study eschatology. When you read just people that don't understand prophecy at all, the commentaries go, we don't know why this is so special. Well, it's prophesying that he's coming back and his Spirit's going to come that way. This deals with his second advent, his second coming, right? The second coming of the Lord. And so we celebrate Christmas as the advent of the first coming of the Lord. This is special, this East Gate, because it is the new Christmas out there, Millennium. It's his second coming. And so the East Gate is special to the Lord. Now, tradition says it's a place of honor and that no one else can use it because of that. That it's sanctified, it's set apart for God's entrance only. Okay? Now, I don't know if you've ever studied the Catholicism around some of these things, but they believe it has also a reference to Mary and her virginity, that this is part of their false teaching, that when you hear the Immaculate Conception in the Catholic Church, we all know they're talking about Jesus being born without sin. The Catholics are talking about Mary being born without sin. And that sin that was shut off, that it could not enter her, she had no sin. So it's almost like she's the sinless person. That's why the Catholics have some problems, because they mess with the deity of God and they give deity to Mary in that. And so they use this in that realm. I just thought if you have some Catholic friends, some of them who study some of these things might say, oh yeah, we know about the East Gate. It has to deal with Mary's virginity and that she was an immaculate conception. And so just thought I'd throw that out there for you in that, all right? Let's pick it up. As you see this prince, we're going to have more details about this prince and now the priest, verses 4 through 9. Then the man brought me by the way of the north gate to the front of the temple. I looked and saw the glory of the Lord filling the temple of the Lord, and I fell face down. Then the Lord said to me, Son of man, look carefully, listen closely, and give attention to everything I tell you concerning all the regulations and the instructions regarding the temple of the Lord. Give attention to the entrance to the temple and all the exits of the sanctuary. Say to the rebellious Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says, enough of your detestable practices. This is being reiterated, what he heard in chapter 43, if it sounds familiar to you, okay? People of Israel, in addition to all your other detestable practices, you brought foreigners uncircumcised in your heart and flesh into my sanctuary, desecrating my temple while you offered me food, fat, and blood, and you broke my covenant. Instead of carrying out your duty in regard to my holy things, you put others in charge of my sanctuary. This is what the sovereign Lord says. No foreigner uncircumcised in heart and flesh is to enter my sanctuary, not even the foreigners who live among the Israelites. All right. So he's giving this instruction here, and he's talking about the priest and what they've done. When did they do this? Most scholars believe this probably happens in the third temple. Okay? A lot of desecration takes place. Remember, they've been almost 2,000 years without a temple and all the different aspects of what they had in Levitical law. They're going to make a lot of mess ups. The fact that they will even believe this Antichrist, this false Messiah, that they will allow his image to go in there before they go, we've messed up. We've done something wrong here, haven't we? All right, so here is this. Who is the prince? This is a very important role in here. He's not the Messiah. Jesus enters through the gate. Remember, the prince is not allowed to. Could it be David? Many people say yes. But it could be just an office and not a specific person. I don't have definitive insight by the research of this of who it could be. It leans very heavily that what we see in the millennial reign because Ezekiel spoke to this several times. If you remember back, I think it was in chapter 37 in the dry bones, that David himself would reign from Jerusalem during the millennial reign. Okay? Many believe this is what this is picking up, that the prince is David. Okay? Others say if it's not David, if that was allegory, which we don't know why it would be, it's speaking to a specific office, and because there's a fellowship between this prince and Jesus. Okay? Very, very important. Jesus rules the whole world from Jerusalem, from the throne. David rules Jerusalem during the millennial reign. That's kind of how they take it in this, all right? Now, next week, chapter 45, and we're still got a little bit more to do here in 44, but 45, the prince will do priestly duties for the sin offering along with the priests of the lineage of Zadok, all right? There are some priests who are demoted in this process. That's what the rest of chapter 44 is about. The demotion of the Levitical priests that messed up their sins of iniquity that it's been talking about. They are demoted, and what their role will be in the millennium. Verse 7, referring to the practice, things were detestable. In the actual King James and in the Greek translation, the Septuagint of the Old Testament, it really leans to the word abomination, to the practice that may happen in the abomination of the third temple, meaning they let not only the foreigners in there that were uncircumcised, but they let a image of this false god, the Antichrist, be put in the temple. So many believe what we just read in verse 7 of chapter 44 is speaking about the desecration of the third temple. Okay? All right. Verses 10 through 17, and then we're going to look at the other verses and what they actually mean for the rest of 44. The Levites who went far from me when Israel went astray, and who wandered from me after their idols, must bear the consequences of their sin. This is a teaching lesson in the millennial reign of past things. This is very, very important, okay? Verse 11, they may serve in my sanctuary, having charge of the gates of the temple and serving in it. They may slaughter the burnt offerings and sacrifices for the people, and stand before the people and serve who? Them. But because they served them in the presence of their idols and made the people of Israel fall into sin, therefore I have sworn with an uplifted hand that they must bear the consequences of their sins, declares the sovereign Lord. They are not to come near to serve me as priest, or come near any of my holy things or my most holy offerings. They must bear the shame of their detestable practices. Remember, the millennial age is dotting every I, crossing every T for all the things of Israel. It's going to fulfill the covenants, but it's also fulfilling a consequence of what took place where the Levitical priests in the time of Solomon that went nutso, except for the lineage of Zadok, which we're going to see his name come in here right in a moment. Verse 14, and I will appoint them to guard the temple for all the work that is to be done in it. But the Levitical priests, who are descendants of Zadok, and who guarded my sanctuary when the Israelites went astray from me, are to come near to minister before me. They are to stand before me to offer sacrifices of fat and blood, declares the sovereign Lord. They alone are to enter my sanctuary. They alone are to come near my table to the minister before me and serve me as guards. When they enter the gates of the inner courts, they are to wear linen cloths. They must not wear any woolen garment while ministering at the gates of the inner court or inside the temple. All right. That's an interesting note to finish there in that, and I took my own liberty of what I think that was all about, but let's talk about the descendants of Zadok in closing here. They came to power under King Solomon as the righteous priest. Okay? He was the righteous priest, and his lineage is what's being honored here in the millennium. The other line of the Levitical priests during this time period will feel the weight of iniquities. and it visits unto the third and the fourth generation. This is a teaching time. This is very, very important. Those that are being born in the millennial do not know anything of the Bible. They don't know anything of the history of the world. The world is totally different because people that will be born during the millennial will be born under Christ reigning from earth. So he's going to use things of history to teach those that are born in the millennial. That's the best that most people can get that, and that's number 3. The remainder of the chapter deals with the priests, their clothing, their practices, and their rituals. They will align with the high priest Melchizedek. If you remember when I told you as we were entering into this section that some of the Jews didn't want Ezekiel in their canon of their Bible because of chapters 40 through 48 and the Levitical clothing and the different practices that weren't Levitical practices in the book of Leviticus. It wasn't until a rabbi studied the practices of Melchizedek and the writings and things with very little is known about Melchizedek, that he was what? He was a high priest and he was a king of Salem. What was Salem? Salem is the name of the city of Jerusalem before it becomes Jerusalem. So some believe that he is a typecast or a foreshadow of Jesus. Jesus is the high priest and he is the king of Jerusalem. The high priest is the one that does the atonement for the sins. Okay? And Jesus did the atonements for the sins for the whole world, and he is the king of the world. So that's why the Hebrews in the New Testament says Jesus is in the order of Melchizedek. Now, getting into this, Zadok priests will be serving the Lord. The fallen Levitical priests serve the people in the gates. Zadok's line of ministers or priests serve Jesus himself. What a privilege during that 1,000 years. That's their job, is they're to minister to the Lord while he's here on earth. Interesting here, verses 21 and 22. We ended in 17. It says they're not to wear the wool. I put this, never let them see you sweat, right? Because wool makes you sweat. I've tried to research this. Some say that because sweat has something to do with uncleanliness and different things, but the reality is there's no definitive understanding of this. Their role, the Zadok priests, is to teach about impurities and about the holiness and the purity of God in the millennium. So they may be the ones that have the answer for us in the millennial reign. That's the best I can give you. And so they're the ones that will have to explain it. I can't explain it for you tonight. In the future, during the millennial reign, you got to look up a Zadok lineage priest and say, why can't you wear wool? What's the holiness and the purity aspect that's the message coming out? And again, Jesus is going to be teaching the whole world during that time too. So we're going to learn things of God that we can only fathom at now, because one of the characteristics of God is he's a holy God. Okay? Now, here's some interesting stuff. If you take the time to read the rest of chapter 44, verses 24 through 27, they will minister on the Sabbath and on the new moon feast. Feast or festival is an interchangeable word. It's the 7 feasts that Israel has. These are the only times the temple will be open. And guess where they get that? That's told true of the temple in heaven. It's only open on the Sabbath and during the feast. How interesting. So the temple's not open all the time. And in the millennium, for the Jews especially, not necessarily for the Gentiles, but the Jews will be honoring God on the Sabbath. So if you have Seventh-day Adventist friends, you can say, you got a good portion of that right, but it doesn't mean it's also for us Gentiles. It's definitely true for Israel. There's going to be a different aspect. He's training up the millennial reign. He's training up and fulfilling all the covenants to Abraham and to David and teaching that generation what it meant to be a Jew, all the Jews that are being born during that time. Now, let me tell you what they're doing in this. Just as we take communion in looking back, when they were doing sacrifices, they were looking forward to what was coming. Okay? In the millennial reign, the sacrifices they will be doing it like we as Gentiles take communion. They will be doing it looking back to the one who fulfilled that sacrifice at Calvary. Okay, so it's teaching a whole generation of Jews to look back and see what it was all about. Death happens in the millennial. It's not until the great white throne judgment and a new heaven, a new earth, a new Jerusalem. You might have thought Jerusalem is a Jewish capital. Many eschatologists believe Jerusalem is the capital of heaven. Jerusalem meaning the reign of God, and that God, when he creates a new heaven and new earth, he creates a new Jerusalem. The one with the big dimensions that we can't figure out how wide and high and all the rest, that's not the millennial Jerusalem. The millennial temple is the one that really takes up the whole Temple Mount that you're getting here in Ezekiel. The huge Jerusalem comes after the great white throne judgment. So Jerusalem's in the future. It's not just associated with the Jews. The temple will not just be associated with the Jews. The temple was a replica here on earth from what was in heaven. All right, so some glimpses of what heaven stores. Now, some people have a lot of problem with the sacrifices taking place. It's troubling to a lot of people going, wait a minute, animals still have to die and everything? And again, it's in commemorating what they're looking back to, not because it doesn't bring any salvation. It's a commemoration and a teaching part of it. Does it bother a lot of Christians that there will be sacrifices in the millennium? Absolutely. It's a contentious part of the debate about the millennium, that it's there. It's in the Bible. I personally wouldn't choose to have them there. I don't like seeing anything die. But again, it's showing again a time period where you can still sin, where death is possible, though you could live a long time. There's no devil, but the devil will be released along with the spirit of Gog and Magog at the end time to deceive the nations for one last time before we go to the great white throne judgment. That's kind of the wrap up. Whew.